I think it really is just drawing out the process of recovery because there's a fantasy that I'll get the keys, I'll run this tool, and magically all my systems will be back online. But it turns out you still got to bring in the forensics team. You still got to restore from the tape backups if you fear the data may have been tampered with. There's no shortcuts when you're ransomed. The best shortcut is to try to be better prepared and avoid the attack to begin with.
You're listening to KBcast, the cybersecurity podcast for all executives. Cutting through the jargon and hype to understand the landscape where risk and technology meet. Now, here's your host, Carissa Breen.
Joining me today is Chester Wisniewski, Field CTO, Applied Research from Sophos, and today we're discussing State of Ransomware 2023 report. For those of you wanting to dig a little bit deeper into the report, we will be linking this in the show notes. So Chester, thanks for joining and welcome.
Thanks for having me on today.
So I want to begin with, according to the report, the rate of ransomware attacks declined in Australia in 2022. So tell me more.
Well, of course, being that this survey is done anonymously, that there's lots of things that can affect these numbers, and it's difficult for us to know always precisely why these numbers are changing. But my suspicion, based on my own experience working with our customers in Australia, is I think organizations are finally getting better at detecting and responding as much as preventing, right? And I think we've had in the past an overemphasis on prevention, which meant people weren't necessarily prepared to detect early that something bad was happening. And a lot of cases, the declines to me appear to be related to, I think we're getting better at security, to be honest, and it's improving the posture. I mean, the numbers are still bad, right? It's 70% of Australian organizations were hit by ransomware in the last year. It's nothing to get excited about, but I mean, every journey starts with a step. And if we're stepping in the right direction, hopefully we'll see that trend continue.
Yeah, look, 70% is still a lot. It's 7 out of 10 companies getting hit by that. So maybe let's dive into that a little bit more. So Australian organisations were a victim of ransomware attacks in 2022, as we've just spoken about, and 4% above the global average of 66%. So technically it's gone down since the year before, but then it's still higher on a global scale. So maybe can you make sense of that?
Yeah, a little bit, I think. To your listeners, I may sound American, but I'm actually coming to you from Canada, and we have an incredibly similar marketplace here in Canada as far as the size of our population, the size of the organizations that exist to service the market here in Canada is very similar to Australia in size as well. And I think what that translates to is fewer really large organizations with enormous budgets to defend, tens of thousands of employees and seats, and more mid-sized organizations and smaller organizations that don't have the scale to necessarily spin up and operate large-scale, security operation centers and this type of stuff. So these numbers historically have always been a little bit lower for countries with, large enterprise people responding to the survey compared to smaller and mid-sized companies. And I think that plays a role in this, right? Because I've been doing this for 25 years. And I think, one of the trends that we're seeing the last 5 to 10 in particular is attacks are no longer automated and they're moving toward humans operating them, which means you need humans actively ready to detect and respond and react to those situations. And smaller organizations, of course, just don't have the money necessarily for 24/7, 365 security operation centers and that kind of thing. So I think it does put us a little bit on the back foot.
Most definitely. So on that 70% with AI, and now they're saying, people are attacking us with our AI and then we're defending with AI, etc. So would you envision that 70%? I mean, look, you don't have to have all the answers. It's just your opinion. Do you think that 70% will stay there? Do you think it'll increase now with everything that's going on with the AI, which is increasing the velocity of attacks and everything that's going on? But I don't think that's going to decrease. I know that sounds a little bit pessimistic, but I'm also a realist.
Yeah, when we look at, the way the criminals are getting in, large numbers of them, well more than half are getting in through either unpatched vulnerabilities or stolen credentials. And so when we see that, as you say, 70%, is it really going to come down if we're going to remain as bad at patching? I mean, telling people to patch stuff is certainly not a revelation for anyone in security. We've been saying this since the introduction of Patch Tuesday almost 20 years ago. And yet we still see huge numbers of organizations falling victim to that. So yeah, I'm a little I'm optimistic and pessimistic. I think we will see the number come down slowly over time, but I don't think we're going to see any dramatic shifts or bumps necessarily. What we're hoping to see at a minimum, though, is, there's a lot of stages to these attacks. And if we're trying harder and we're getting the message out on what the most effective things are that organizations should do, then we'll have a pretty good crack at least perhaps catching it before all the damage is done, right? Like in a ransomware incident, the last step is triggering the ransomware. Before that, it might be stealing the data. And before that, they've got to navigate your Active Directory and figure out, how to elevate their privileges to administrator or things like that. So maybe if we can shift left in that attack chain, the number 70% might not come down, but the impact on those organizations and the cost to them and the time to recover might reduce.
Okay, so there's a couple of things in there I want to explore a little bit more. Patch Tuesday, yes, agree. 20 years, agree. The thing that gets me, and every time I speak to people about patch management, everyone keeps calling it basics. It's just so basic, just patch. But then it's to your point, Chester, we've been saying this for 20 years and we still can't get it right. So, I've spoken to the CTO of Tenable about this at length, and someone else referred to it recently around it's the foundations of cybersecurity. But yet, I still don't think people get it. And then we're calling it basic, but it's not basic. So what are your thoughts?
Patching is a lot harder than it sounds. To be fair to you, the effort I have to put into keeping my home network and lab patched is quite a bit of effort, right? I literally spend hours every month on it, and it's just stuff I own, let alone having to do it at scale. And of course, in professional IT environments, we're using tools to do this, but there's so many complexities here that I think people don't take into consideration. And again, looking at these smaller and mid-sized companies, I think one of the reasons we see this fail is we're trying to share resources across IT staff that have to do all these things. Typically, it's not a security team that's doing the patching. If you have a security team, you're usually working with IT saying, here are the things that we notice that need to be patched. Can you please go do it? At the same time, that IT team is also launching the new CRM system for your sales organization so that they can be more efficient and sell more product. At the same time, that IT team is also trying to move their Exchange server to the cloud as part of their cloud initiatives. These things, we're competing for these resources, right? And patching often gets relegated to second-class citizens because IT directors are compensated, they get bonuses for completing that CRM project that's going to have a return on investment to the business. They don't get compensated on whether the Cisco firewall gets patched. And so, unfortunately, you keep pushing those things to the side when you don't have enough resource. And one project is going to be tied to your compensation, and the other one is, well, what's the likelihood the criminals are going to find our Fortinet gateway or our Sophos firewall? Well, we can do that next month because if I don't put the resources on it, I can't achieve my targets. And I think that's a lot of what's happening in the smaller orgs as well.
Great word, relegated. So you mentioned before, Chester, the complexities are there. Would you be able to walk through what some of those complexities are? Because I totally agree with you.
Well, you mentioned Tenable. They speak to this far better than I can, but just discovering all the assets you have to even know that they can be patched or that there's patches available to them. And, a lot of the conversation at the government level, certainly in the United States with CISA, but in a lot of other countries as well, is around things like a software bill of materials, because half the time, I don't think organizations even recognize that they have some software running in their environments because it's included as part of some other system. And if you look at, some of the headlines, and I know in Australia, there's been a disturbing amount of data breaches related to healthcare and things like that. It's a similar thing. And these healthcare organizations are being hit by vulnerabilities that are known for 2 or 3 years old, like Log4j or Proxy Shell or Proxy Login and Exchange servers, these types of things. But sometimes those organizations aren't even aware they have that version of Java installed in their environments. They don't even know it's there. So just inventorying the vast amount of software and hardware that is in a given environment is challenging. And these unknown devices connecting to our network can introduce a platform for these criminals to dwell on. I don't know if most IT departments recognize that the lifts in their building are probably connected to the network so that the company that maintains the lift can monitor the maintenance on it. And is that a place where, an attack can be launched? The Coke machine probably calls home to say, I'm low on Sprite. Please come fill me up. And that's probably on your network. So this is a difficult problem just to identify what has to be patched, let alone to have the IT resources to run around and patch it all.
Yeah, I know, and you're so right. And as you know, as things keep evolving, and if it depends on the organization, if it's super old, you've got legacy systems. I mean, you've got critical systems. You got all sorts of things that not even knows what's going on. So I guess it's hard to even know what you've got, let alone patch it. So I think that these are great points. But then, just a curious thought: do you think people, or curious question, do you think people should move away by saying patching is basic? Because it's not. Like, everyone just comes up and says, oh, you got to do the basics in cybersecurity. Like I said, in theory, reading from a book sounds easy, but then doing it in reality is fundamentally hard. Like you said, like just patching your own stuff personally is a big task, let alone doing it for a company that's got 50,000 people and it's 100 years old.
Yeah, I think one of the things we're starting to see is this move toward zero trust network access. We're seeing the move toward having certain critical things in cloud services. All these things help solve the patching problem to a degree, because if you're using Office 365 for your email or something, you no longer have to worry about what version of Exchange you're on and whether you updated it last month and whether there's a new zero-day attack and this kind of thing. And by using zero trust, we're also limiting the damage that one of those unpatched things can cause, right? I think the reason unpatched systems can cause so much damage is typically that is sort of like gaining access to the entire unprotected inside network, if I can use virtual air quotes around the word inside. And the truth is, of course, again, those of us that are in the security space for a long time know there is no inside, but unfortunately, most organizations are still structured that way. So I personally look at it and go, I know I'm not going to be able to patch everything. There's certain things that are a higher priority because of the data they hold or the access they grant if they're compromised. And those ones need to be in that tier one. They must be patched, and those patches must be deployed in a pretty tight time frame or an SLA. But the rest of it, we have to just acknowledge we're never going to be able to patch every endpoint, every workstation, every software product. The question is, can we limit the damage if that thing is compromised so that personal information, private information, sensitive things aren't being compromised, and that it doesn't provide entry to all the things on the network because none of them have any security once you get past the gatekeepers.
So you mentioned something before, that this is the way companies are structured that way. Obviously not ideal. So hold that thought. Now, I was speaking to a guy, years ago on this podcast, and he was saying, and he was some PhD, super smart guy, was talking about, I used to work in a bank, and saying that typical old school banks can't compete with a digital bank. So there's just no point trying to, in air quotes, do a digital transformation to a digital bank. So some of them are just building a digital bank on the side, and then eventually they'll just move over. So then it goes back to my original question around, like, why are they structured that way? Is it just too hard that they just can't evolve? No one knows how to do it. It's very costly. It's very expensive. It's disruptive. Would you say that that's why people aren't moving towards a new structure?
I think it's the investment and convincing management that investment is going to pay off in the end. And I think upper management in many organizations underestimate the risks presented by the existing infrastructure and just aren't and won't invest in it. And it was very interesting, especially in ASEAN, to see during the pandemic, the shift in organizations recognizing that if we're going to have to spend all this money for remote workforce, maybe this is the time that we're going to get management to give us the budget to just go do the right thing, right? And, I was talking to some potential customers and existing customers of ours in the region, and they're like, well, the easy thing is for me to buy 2 more VPN concentrators because everybody's going to be connecting in remotely. But really, I know that the VPN concentrator is a vulnerability in my security strategy, because if I'm just allowing you to log in with a password and suddenly you get access to the whole network, I haven't really done anything. So I can spend the same money and get 80% of the way to my ZTNA project. Why am I messing around with VPN concentrators? I'm just going to ask for a little bit more money, pad out my request while I got this COVID excuse to bootstrap the network. And I'm going to skip right over the idea of expanding the old thing while I slowly plod along with my security strategy. And I think a lot of us could use to take a few pages from that book and look at, in Africa, we're not going and deploying copper phone lines where they never had them. We're skipping over it and going to 5G, right? Like, why go through all the steps along the way of technology slowly advancing and costing time and money? It's much better to leapfrog right to where the better answers are. And I think organizations, when they have those business transformation opportunities, whether it is one of these digital transformation projects or whether it's a crisis like COVID, take advantage of it and see if you can reallocate that budget toward the correct solution rather than the next step in the line.
So true. It makes logical sense. So let's turn back to some of the other insights from the report that I observed. And one of the things that was interesting is the average payment has skyrocketed, which I'm not surprised about. But then when comparing to 2021 to 2022, data from the 13 Australian respondents that shared the actual ransoms paid suggests payments have soared, with the average coming in at US $1,513,436, which is a huge jump from the last year's figure of 226,863, which was based off 65 respondents according to report. So that was a lot to get through. So in theory, the amount of attacks have declined, but the payments from ransoms have inclined. So I guess that means we're kind of still in a bad position, depends on which way you look at it. But from the previous year, so would you say, Chester, criminals are just holding out for a larger payment rather than just like smaller ransoms? Or what are your sort of thoughts behind that?
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on there. There's certainly been raising, this modern ransomware era started in 2013. And, all along the way, we've seen them kind of experiment with pricing and experiment with different kinds of extortion to see how high they can get those prices to be. And I think they're also being selective about industries that they're targeting where they may be more pressure on those organizations to pay quickly to restore services, right? So we have seen a lot of attacks in healthcare because clearly if you can't go to the emergency department, that's kind of a problem. And you might be very much pressured to pay more quickly to get those services restored. So I think all those things are putting a little bit of an upward pressure. And in fact, even the median ransomware payment in our Australian data was over $1 million. And that's an astonishingly large amount of money for most organizations. But, that's separate from the cost of recovery, right? And much of that's being covered as well by insurance companies. So there's a lot of moving parts here. It's very difficult sometimes to tease out the root causes, because we did notice that organizations that had cyber insurance policies were much more likely, in the global data, they were much more likely to pay the ransom. I think the Australian data is too small of a sample set for us to draw any specific Australian conclusions. But certainly in the global information, there was a clear line that insurance companies, I think, are willing to pay the ransom to hope it reduces the cost of recovery.
Okay, so again, you don't have to have all the answers. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts. So I was interviewing a guy yesterday. He is a lawyer, and he was sort of saying there are talks around the government in Australia is going to try to mandate you just can't pay the ransom, like no matter what. But then I've had people on the show that have given really interesting insights around why they sometimes just pay it, because if you got to get a whole full-blown security team comes in, does all the stuff, it just can cost a lot more, takes a lot longer. So sometimes it's faster to just pay the ransom and it's cheaper. But then other people are like, no, but then you're fueling like criminal activity. So just say hypothetically they bring this law and you just can't pay it. How do you think that's going to go?
Well, I think it's going to result in a higher number of bankruptcies is what I suspect. My personal experience with talking to some victims that pay, usually the ones that are not, the paying out of pocket, say not through their insurance company, it's because they don't have any backups and they have no other way of recovering the data. And it's likely a business ending event if they cannot regain access to some of their critical databases and files. And so a law preventing it would certainly impact those businesses, probably permanently, right? The other thing is typically paying the ransom does not reduce the cost of the incident. So we measured in the survey the cost of recovery in addition to the cost of excluding the ransom, right? So we said, well, did you pay a ransom or not? And then with not including the ransom amount, how much did it cost you to recover? And in fact, it was cheaper to recover not paying the ransom than paying the ransom in our survey data. So the idea that you're saving money by paying the ransom isn't really there, but the idea that you may have no access to the data if you don't pay the ransom, or the speed with which you can recover may be faster by paying the ransom. And I think that's tempting enough that preventing it would be a pretty big business disruption. I mean, at a personal level, I'm like, ban it, like just stop people. If we stop paying, then this whole crime goes away. but it seems pretty difficult to control. And I'm not sure the public has an appetite for the mayhem that may be caused by it.
Yeah, look, and there's so many variables to this and everything you sort of listed out. The answer is it depends because there's those variables. But then going back to the cost of recovery, you were saying that was inherently more expensive than just paying the ransom. Why do you think that was the case?
In many cases, I believe it's because they spent days negotiating with the criminals. They then finally got the encryption keys, and then they realized, oh, only 60% of our files are even going to decrypt. We still need to go back to our backups to restore our systems. Or we got the encryption keys and we're able to get access to our data, but we don't trust the integrity of our systems and we still need to go rebuild them. We need to burn them down and start over because who knows what backdoors, who knows what credentials or API keys or other things may have been stolen in the attack. So usually you have the entire cost of recovery, whether you pay the ransom or not, because those systems are no longer trustworthy anyway. You may not get all your files back because it turns out the criminals are much better at scrambulating your files than descrambling them. And if not all of them descramble, there's no magic trick to getting them back. And in fact, almost none of the victims get 100% of their files back, even if they pay the ransom. So I think it really is just drawing out the process of recovery because there's a fantasy that I'll get the keys, I'll run this tool, and magically all my systems will be back online. But it turns out you still got to bring in the forensics team. You still got to bring in people to rebuild the servers. You still got to restore from the tape backups if you fear the data may have been tampered with. There's no shortcuts when you're ransomed. The best shortcut is to try to be better prepared and avoid the attack to begin with. So
I've spoken to people on the show and interviewed many people that they're saying if the criminal gang didn't give you everything back, their business model's flawed then. Like they do give it back because they know people are going to pay, or else if they sort of figured out that you're never going to get everything back, like no one would ever pay. But you're saying you don't really get 100% of your files and data and everything back.
Yeah, it's rare that you get 100%. Now, in fairness, what people say that is correct. I mean, the criminals largely almost always give you the keys. They will provide you tech support if their tools aren't working well, and their tools are often quite poor. In fact, I know a few of our competitors have written their own decryptor tools that are better than the ones the criminals give them because they operate more efficiently and more reliably than the decryptors the criminals provide. But I mean, the criminal intention is there for you to get your files back. There's no doubt about that, but it's rare that you ever get all of it back. I don't think we measured it this year, but I want to say in last year's ransomware report, we asked people questions about that. And I want to say on average, it was around 80% of the data was restored from paying for the encryption keys. So about 1/5, and who knows which fifth that is. Is that the important fifth or an unimportant fifth that you didn't get back?
So why don't they just give it all back? Like, what's the logic behind it? Like, I understand what you're saying, but why?
Oh, it's just flaws in the way that they're encrypting the files, right? Most of these ransomwares will only open a file and maybe they encrypt the first 200 kilobytes and they store the public key for the private key that they're encrypting with in the header of the file there's a lot of manipulation of the data and they rarely do the entire file. It's not like they're just running OpenSSL or PGP or something across all your files in a reliable manner. They're trying to do it expediently so that if you detect them mid-process that they've already encrypted all the important stuff. So they want the process to be very fast. You know, there's a lot of shortcuts that the criminals are taking for their own advantage to make sure that they've got you hamstrung. And not all of that damage can always be undone if there's bugs and flaws in their code.
Have you ever heard of a case where someone sort of said, or in part of your report, that, like you said, the 1/5 that doesn't come back? Would you say that, have people ever said, oh my goodness, that's the stuff I actually really need and I haven't got it back and it's gone?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And then we're asking them, please tell us your backups are safe. Please tell us that you're still doing, offsite backups and this is another thing the criminals have been doing to get that ransom payment number higher as well, as they target your backups as a first part of their process in most cases. So if you've got Veeam tied into your Active Directory, and this is in no way picking on Veeam, it's, from what I understand, it's a great product, but if you've integrated your authentication to a product like a cloud backup service, then the criminals, once they have your credentials, they just log into your cloud backup service and delete them. It's not like the old days where I used to carry tapes home in a case back in the 90s. Organizations typically don't back up that way. So it's another consideration as part of an incident response plan is to go, are our backups behind different authentication than the criminals may have been able to acquire, or do they require a hardware security token to access them and things like that?
The other thing I've heard as well is apparently with some of these ransomware criminal gangs that once, you're negotiating, they'll even say, if you pay us more, we'll tell you how we how he did it and how he got in, and like there's even stuff like that. Have you heard of that part of your research?
Absolutely. I hate to laugh because it means that somebody was victimized and terrible things happened. But you're just shocked when you read like a pen test report from a criminal going, here's, the window that you left unlatched that I came in. And then when I got in, the reason I was able to do this is because, we have a feature in our product called tamper protection that's designed to, stop it from being turned off or removed and that kind of thing. And they're like, oh, we saw that you were running Sophos and that's a really good product, but unfortunately you didn't configure tamper protection, so we just turned it off. They are quite arrogant in these reports when they write them, but to my surprise, although they're unprofessional, their opinions are usually pretty accurate about the mistakes that led to the victim being compromised. I don't think it's worth paying the ransom to get that kind of pen test report. I think you should hire some legitimate penetration testers, but they're good for their word. They do provide reports and they're usually quite detailed.
So do you have to pay extra for that?
I haven't personally seen one that said you had to pay extra. It was if you pay the ransom, we'll also provide you with a report. I would have to consult with our incident response team because, of course, I don't deal with as many victims day to day. But the ones I've seen, it was just like part of the package deal that you get for paying the ransom.
So does that rattle customers then? Like, okay, we've paid the ransom and now we're getting this full-blown detailed report. Like, that's pretty rattling because it's coming from a criminal, right? It's not coming from like a legitimate company.
Yeah, well, and I think in most cases, they just didn't realize how exposed they were, that somebody was able to march in and sort of map out their entire business and figure out how to hold them hostage all in a couple of days. I mean, the median in the ransomware cases this year from the initial breach to the time that they triggered the ransomware was about 8 days. In our active adversary report, another complementary report to this one that we did earlier this year. And, 8 days is a reasonably long time if you're actively threat hunting to detect that something's going on. But I think when the customers get those pen test reports and they realize that, in a week, these people not only broke in, but they like completely decoded our entire business processes and figured out how to hold us hostage and demand $1 million. It's pretty surprising, I think.
So then the other insight from the report that I observed were that 53% of organizations that had data encrypted paid the ransom. So that is pretty high. And as you sort of alluded to before, Chester, or as you mentioned that, we should just stop paying. And then the business mindset just goes away because it doesn't exist anymore. But then there's still 53%. That's more than half, just.
Yeah, and it's been increasing, right? I want to say 2 years ago it was in the mid 30s, and again, I suspect that's due to insurance. Insurance companies are paying these ransoms. Insurance companies typically have negotiators, so they're getting a lower ransom payment than they might have. But we've even seen, I think it was in 2022, there was a couple of these ransomware groups actually targeted insurance companies, broke into the insurance company, didn't encrypt them, just stole their customer list of who had cyber insurance, and then one after the next, specifically targeted their customers because they knew they would pay the ransom. And so I'm very skeptical of cyber insurance the way it's currently operating personally. And while we have some partnerships with some cyber insurance firms, the ones we're working with, I think, are doing the right things. They're not, aiming to pay the ransom per se, but they're also ensuring that you have 24/7 security monitoring of your stuff, that you're using modern things, that, you're following a lot of the practices that we know lead to people being less victimized. But unfortunately, the industry as a whole may be fueling this. And that's another place I think governments maybe have some leverage, as opposed to saying, we're going to ban all ransom payments. Perhaps they ban insurance companies from paying ransoms or look at other creative regulations specifically targeting insurance in order to lower that number of ransom payments.
So what are you skeptical about specifically? I mean, look, you raise a great point. And these things are not easy answers, and there's no sort of one size fits all. I'm just, trying to get your opinion on the matter.
There's always a downside to no matter what approach we're going to take. I mean, in the United States, they've taken the approach of sanctioning a lot of the Russian state-aligned groups, which has probably reduced some ransom payments, but all it's really done is create more confusion, which is the ransom group changes their name every 3 weeks, so nobody can tell if they're under sanctions or not, and then you continue to pay the ransoms. So in addition to these things being really hard to decide what's right and wrong, on top of that, we're also still playing the cat and mouse game with the criminals that we're always playing while we're trying to, improve ourselves and make better decisions. So it's going to be a political mess. And hopefully what I'm seeing is different experiments going on. The United States is doing one thing, Australia is doing another thing, the United Kingdom's doing a third thing. The EU's got a lot of cyber legislation on the table as well. Everybody recognizes what a giant problem this is. And by learning from each of those different approaches, hopefully we can come together and figure out what the best mix of approaches is. But we were slow out of the gate getting started, and we got a lot to make up for, considering government and law enforcement hadn't been very active in this until the last year or two.
And look, I'm not some insurance expert at all. From my understanding, and look, this is not, I don't know everything, but from my understanding, it's, for example, there's an issue, you've got an insurance policy, like you have to like call them straight away within like, I don't know, X amount of hours or something. And if you don't do that, it's like you're not covered. And then it's like, so we took out this whole insurance policy, we did all of this, and then someone didn't follow the protocol or the process, and then it straight away they can turn around and say, oh, there's a caveat for that and we're not covering you now. Have you seen a bit of that?
I have not. I mean, my understanding from our incident responders is that the times when insurance have been involved, it's largely been a positive process, and that they've got their own, incident response people that are experienced at dealing with ransomware situations. And that often helps the customer respond a little more quickly to the incident than they might have if they had to go and hire an outside firm. My understanding for most victims is they've not gotten much hassle from the insurance companies, but the insurance companies are losing so much money. It's inevitable that they're going to continue to add more and more restrictions, more and more requirements. We have seen the price of insurance go dramatically up. I want to say it more than doubled year over year in the UK. I was talking to some colleagues there about insurance. We're seeing more and more baseline requirements, not just being that your computers are patched, but you must have XDR software. You must have 24/7 monitoring. And it used to be those were things that got you a discount in your policy because they were considered good practices. And now it's like, no, you're not even getting a policy at all if you don't have this stuff. Like, you're still going to pay full price, but we're not even going to let you come to the game if you don't have these bare minimum, reasonably monitored and advanced things. And I think that's really where the key is for the insurance companies to reduce their losses, is this stuff has to be, you can't just have the tools. You have to actually have trained people using the tools. Buying the tools is not enough. And in the past, insurance seemed to be more of a check mark to buy things. And now I think they're wising up that it's really about the human beings knowing what to do with the tools that makes the difference between a victim and an organization that defends themselves well.
Yeah, look, probably what you're saying is definitely more accurate. I think this was just going back a fair few years ago. And I mean, I don't speak at length. I haven't really interviewed anyone in 200 episodes around the ins and outs of insurance policies. Maybe I should. So then I'm curious to know, like, where do we go from here? Like, do you have any insights you're willing to share with the audience? Just your opinion or anything that sort of like sparked your interest when you were looking at the report, for example?
Well, I think, what the report tells me, sadly, at a high level, without going into any specific stat, is just this is still a giant problem and it's not really getting any better. I mean, the global numbers year over year was literally within 1% of the previous year as far as the number of organizations being victimized. And while it reduced in Australia by 10%, I'm not sure that's particularly heartening. I think there's a few things, I'm really pleased to see like Claire O'Neill's approach in the Australian government and how serious the government seems to be taking this. I think the next step we need to be looking at, based on how bad this problem is how do we get the right people to consume the information that's being produced by the government, by the AFP, by, all the different groups that are providing this information? Because I think that's the next gap that we have to plug. Organizations that are on the ball enough to recognize that ransomware is a problem, have decided to do what they can to batten down the hatches, are largely successful in defending themselves. It's the ones that aren't listening to the messages that are coming out that are the ones that repeatedly end up, unfortunately, as one of these statistics in our surveys. So we have to more effectively either require organizations to consume that material, or we have to more effectively communicate it to them so they understand the risk, because almost every executive at a victim that I've spoken to in the last 5 years literally was unaware that this kind of thing could happen to them, right? Like, they weren't just going, I was aware of it and I just decided not to spend money. They were like, I had no idea that this was that big of a problem. I thought, maybe 10 companies a day in the whole world were being hit with this stuff. I didn't realize it was 1,000, right?
Why didn't they have an idea? Well, it's not what they do day to day, I guess. They're not as invested in it as people like me and you.
Well, that's just it, right? And I think that's one of the things I can blame the industry for as well, is that we assume people are listening at all to what we have to say. And we also assume that their basic knowledge is a lot more advanced than it likely really is. And we need to be able to have these conversations at a level that is consumable to the people who need to hear it. And we need to make sure that we're not blaming victims and that we're there with a helping hand when they need it. And we also need to make it clear to them the multitude of resources that are available to help organizations improve themselves, because there's a lot out there. There's tons of industry alliances. There's information sharing groups. There's government agencies that are out there to help. There's a lot of things if you're aware of the problem and you're trying to do something about it. And that not only are you not alone, but this is actually winnable, right? Like, organizations that put the effort into it are largely coming out of these attacks unscathed, even if they have an initial breach. And trying does matter, and it will protect your organization.
So, Chester, is there any sort of closing comments or final thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with today?
I think the closing comment from me that is the biggest factor of those things I was just talking about is being able to detect those things when they're started and recognize that it's a problem. And the shift in mindset is not that my antivirus or my endpoint security detected, a Trojan, therefore it blocked it and I'm safe. Instead, it should be, there was a human that tried to put that Trojan on that computer. Perhaps I should start an investigation and figure out what they're up to. And if we can shift that mindset, we'll be in, I think, pretty good graces in the end.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope that you found today's episode useful and you took away a few key points. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to get our latest episodes.
This podcast is brought to you by MercSec, the specialists in security, search, and recruitment solutions. Visit mercsec.com to connect today.
If you'd like to find out how KBI can help grow your cyber business, then please head over to kbi.digital.
This podcast was brought to you by KBI.media, the voice of cyber.